My name's Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights. I'm an old gal. I've been in the supply chain space for 40 years. When people ask me what I do, I say, well, I'm a bit of a social scientist. I do quantitative research. You'll actually see me on LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn as my panel to get real-time data about what do supply chain professionals think, what's top of mind. And so a little plug, if you see my panels, join in, and we always give you the data. The other thing is, I'm a bit of a critic, and I tell it like it is and explore direct feedback. I'm trying to move the market along. And I'm a bit of a fortune teller and a bit of a curmudgeon, and what I'm going to do today is really help you with what is the future of supply chain planning and how should we think about it. I'm so excited. I actually have been in the supply chain planning market, building software, being an analyst for 25 years, and I don't think I've ever seen the level of technology. That's the great news. The bad news is I don't think people are ready for it. And one of the things that concerns me as I sit on panels like today is organizations come in all different shapes and flavors. I work with companies that have 600 planners. I work with companies that have one planner. I work with global companies. I work with regional companies, and their needs are very, very different. So one of the things we can't do is generalize planning. So we're having a little trouble in the actual projections, so I don't know if you can bring up my slides. Backstage, we're having a little technology problem, so we'll see here. Can you see the slides out here? Okay, good. So I write for the Supply Chain Leader. When I worked for Gartner was all about the technologist. I write for the Supply Chain Leader. And I want to start with what is today's reality? Today's reality is that companies that manufacture, distribute, or have retail operations are stuck. 90% are stuck. And what do I mean by that? They're stuck at the intersection of operating margin, inventory turns, growth, and return on invested capital. And we talk about best practices, but I say, how can we have best practices if 90% of companies are stuck? It just does not make any sense. As we went from regional to global supply chains, what's happened is the supply chain has become far more complex. If you look at forecastability, the ability to forecast, or you look at complexity of the item master, or you look at transportation, we have a far more complex supply chain, and our traditional engines or optimizers were all about linear optimization, and what we're seeing is the need for nonlinear relationships, the use of streaming data, unstructured data, and companies want to grow, and unfortunately growth is slowing, and you need the supply chain to grow. So the building of these new capabilities is really important. Now, one of my surprises as being an analyst is that the productivity gains from the fourth and third industrial revolution stopped in 2004. So I actually was part of that. I remember when we got our first portable computer that took 3 guys to carry down the hallway. Remember those? They were far from portable. My first mobile phone that was far from mobile. And I thought that the impact was far more pervasive, but it wasn't. In 2004, productivity impacts from personal computers and mobile devices actually stopped in the manufacturing world. Now, if we think about that, the back office, where most of the supply chain leaders live, really did not change that much. Most of us still use EDI. I liken EDI to a piece of mail that I've got to open. It's not bidirectional. It doesn't really have the data that's current. And we've not made much process improvement on B2B or building value networks. Most of our work has been around the enterprise. Along with that, risk has increased. Global risk, supplier risk. And in our research, we look at what does this mean? And so if you look at the bubbles, the size of the bubble is the size of the risk. And yes, you see economic uncertainty, and we certainly feel that. And the tie between globalism and nationalism, But look at the size of demand volatility. Most companies don't step back and ask themselves the question of how does my ability to forecast today differ than 5 years ago? And if you would run the same algorithms, you'll find that most companies have really changed and that it's much more difficult to forecast today than it used to be. Forecast error has increased, bias can have increased, and so one of the issues is how do we manage risk in the face of supply and demand uncertainty? The answer is planning. The answer is network design. The answer is being able to look at alternatives. Today, only 1/3 of companies have what-if capabilities, the ability to not just look at what is, but what could be, and to really tie strategy to action. So when we think about this manifesto for change, I go to a lot of conferences, and when I worked for a company called AMR Research, I had actually worked with about 600 companies, and I believe that most companies had invested 1.7% of revenue and driven improvement at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. And I was shocked when I found that most companies are stuck, and they're not stuck, you know, a little. They're stuck a lot, like gum on the bottom of your shoe on a hot summer day. I mean, have you ever tried to get it off? I mean, it's just, you know, stuck. Most companies are very stuck because of a focus on functional metrics and a belief that is wrongful that we've made a lot more progress than we have. Because the supply chain is increasingly become a complex, nonlinear system. I don't know how many of you got to take process control theory in college. I got to take it a couple of times. God bless my professor. Yeah, one of those classes. But you know, the intersection between these metrics have distinct relationships that are very different by company, and they're complex and they're nonlinear, and the balance of a balanced scorecard is only present in about 2% of companies. Most companies manage by functional metrics, and the result is an orbit chart that looks like this. So in my company, every year we plot orbit charts by industry, by company, which looks at the complexity between two metrics and the pattern, and we study pattern recognition by industry. And this is actually the food industry, and it isn't that much different if I showed you telecommunications or pharmaceuticals or household products or retail. What you see in this plot is in 2006, operating margin was much better than what it is in 2016. And this is despite an improvement in oil prices. And the reason is really a focus on functional enterprise processes versus cross-functional processes and embracing complexity. 38% new items were added to the item master. That increased the long tail of the supply chain. Demand latency, or the ability for the order to reflect channel demand, increased 5 times. Increase in demand volatility, functional metrics not aligned, people not actually designing the supply chain, a focus on inside-out processes, and the lack of alignment. So let me show you what I mean by this. Linear optimization is only really good for high volume, very predictable items. Increasingly, we have produced items, new product launch, trade promotion, special assortment, that pushes us out into the long tail of the supply chain where demand latency is high, complexity is high, and there's a need for non-linear. This is what really excites me about machine learning, artificial intelligence, cognitive computing, is the ability to be outside in, use channel demand to be able to look at these patterns and to do it automatically. The challenge is we love to touch data, right? We have all these Excel ghettos where people feel very reinforced by touching data. That's going to be a challenge. The second thing is commodity prices. If we look at commodity volatility in the last decade, we have never seen the level of commodity volatility. If you're doing tactical supply chain planning well, which is from the operational period at the end of the slush period to the tactical horizon, and passing that to aggregate buying for aggregate buying councils, you can better manage procurement. Very few companies do this well. The second and third thing is managing cost is like a decathlete. I love the Olympics. You know, when someone for the decathlon enters the field, they're not going to place first in every event. They're going to place second or third for the best total score. And when I benchmark, I have never found a company that has the best cost in manufacturing, the best cost in transportation, and the best cost in procurement, and have the best total cost. Doesn't happen. Instead, what you've got to do is look at total cost, and only 29% of companies actually have total cost information. Now, in the organization, we can connect data, but if we don't align metrics, balanced scorecards, understanding the cost, then we can't really move forward with decision support tools like Anaplan. This is from our recent research, which looks at where are the gaps in the organization, what's important, and where is alignment. Look at the gap in sales and operations, right? Manufacturing and operations. Tremendous gap in issues. And you only close that alignment by a balanced scorecard. So, you know, I talked about the 90% of companies that were stuck and the 10% that weren't. What made a difference? The first is the executive understanding of supply chain. Start knocking on those doors. Help the supply chain leaders to understand that planning makes a difference. You've got to focus on the important, not just the urgent, to be able to drive strategy to action, supply chain strategy to action. Secondly, supply chain visibility, the ability to get to data, the ability to go across dimensions, across organizations. The average company has 5 to 7 ERP systems, 2 to 3 advanced planning systems. They're not connected, we can't see, and so visibility makes a difference. But the organizational change management of believing in engines, planning, you know, planners need time to plan. Planners need organizational career paths. Planners need to work in organizations that appreciate planning. Most organizations are very reactive. And so the organizational change management to embrace planning is a huge issue. Cross-functional alignment I talked about, and the ability to use data. One of the things that excites me about Anaplan is the usability of data from the systems. So when I think about the future, where are we headed? It's not about your mother's old-fashioned supply chain of inside-out processes. It's not looking at how efficient can I make that manufacturing or transportation or procurement silo. That didn't help me so much. It's not about transactional data, you know, this fallacy that planning needs to be closely coupled to ERP, needs to be kicked to the curb, because only 40% of the data that's needed for planning comes from ERP. And it's not about batch processes and linear optimization. Instead, it's about outside in. It's about the use of channel data, structured data, unstructured data. It's about supplier data. It's about the ability to orchestrate across functions to be able to look at total cost. It's about the design of value networks. What creates value in a network, and how do I maintain it and improve it? And it's about data at the speed of business. Today, we don't have data at the speed of business. The average planner can't see its exceptions until 10:30 in the morning, and then they're not very usable. So the ability to have data at the speed in which I plan, and then the ability to sense and then respond. Today's supply chains don't sense, they respond. And they respond actually on historic patterns that are usually not very helpful. So let's think. Do we have best practices? Absolutely not. The planning systems that we have evolved on 64-bit architectures, on client server, when we didn't have memory and we couldn't get to data, and it's time to rethink planning. Today's planning system success is like a flip of the coin, sort of like being in Las Vegas if I'd go pull a slot machine. You have about that level of success on probability if you actually implement a planning system. So in our research, the top levels of pain for the business that is using planning are the issues of cross-functional alignment. When you're implementing planning, ask the question, what's our balanced scorecard? Ask the question of, how do I get to total cost? Ask the question of, how do I trade off inventory cost and customer service by segment of the business? Push for data. Help companies to really define visibility. And ask the question about demand and supply volatility, the need for what-if analysis, the need for form and function and buffer strategies of inventory, and help your executive team to understand. Because today's satisfaction with planning, I don't care what it is, whether it's revenue management, demand planning, supply planning, sales and operations planning, supplier development is very low. We built systems for the core planners, the people that ran the big engines. And when we look at the difference between best-of-breed providers and the ERP expansionists that tack planning on to ERP systems, there is a much different level of satisfaction. The lowest level of satisfaction is actually with the ERP expansionists because of the low level of usability. Stop it. Ask the question, how do we do it better? How do we define the needs by role? Now, I argue that the first generation of planning was very focused on the core user. I was a core planner when I was in manufacturing. I did forecasting and supply planning, and I actually built algorithms. When we have core planners, which I work with companies that have hundreds of core planners, 10 to 15 core planners like statistics. They like actually getting in the system, running the engines, fine-tuning the engines. Not the business leaders. The business leaders need what-if analysis, they need visualization, and thank heavens we've got descriptive analytics today that allow that, and that's actually one of the great benefits, I think, of Anaplan. And we also need senior management and the collaborative workflows and the ability for what-if with senior management. So my recommendation to Anaplan is they do a surround strategy. You know, SAP APO doesn't have a very high usability, put Anaplan on top of it. JDA hasn't really changed that much, put Anaplan on top of it. Let the core planners be, but bring the descriptive analytics, the collaboration to actually improve user satisfaction. Because I think we've thought about analytics too narrowly. We've thought about analytics for the alphabet soup approach. You know, in supply chain, we tend to talk alphabet soup. My ERP to your ERP, connect your TMS to my WMS, SCM, you know, we go on and on with these acronyms, right? And then we think about analytics as it connects to the acronyms. Forget it. Put analytics as the core competency in the middle, connect it to the workforce productivity, build it outside in, across sales, across supply chain, across supplier engagement, to give the level of visualization across planning systems. And along the way, as you think about the art of the possible, I want you to challenge 4 paradigms that linger in our traditional thinking. The first paradigm is I've got to stuff everything in rows and columns. I've got to have very clean data. I actually work with a company that says they're going to go on a digital transformation, and the first thing they did was they hired McKinsey for a $5 billion project to clean up their master data. And I'm like, that is crazy. Master data management with machine learning and cognitive computing is a whole new frontier. Master data problems are going away because we no longer have to put data in rows and columns. We can put data in data lakes, and we can do schema on read based upon the patterns. So most people have implemented planning systems, and the first thing they did was they defined a demand hierarchy, or they defined the relationship between locations. And the problem is we weren't very smart when we started out, and we learned a lot, and we wanted to change it, and we couldn't change it. But schema on read starts with all the data in the data lake. The intelligence and machine learning and cognitive computing read the data lake and develop the schema. Schema on read is a powerful transformation in this next evolution of planning. The second thing is ERP as the system of record is being greatly diminished in supply chain. The evolution of blockchain, the evolution of planning systems of record are challenging ERP as the backbone of supply chain. Really challenge what end-to-end means. Third is, not everything has to be in a structured hierarchy, right? We're going to unstructured and structured data, embrace it, make a list of all the unstructured data and think about how you can use it. And the fourth is, most of the engines in supply chain today are linear optimization. As we go from descriptive to predictive analytics, which we've had today, to prescriptive analytics that not only tell us an exception, but what we do about it, and perhaps link that exception to some action, or cognitive computing, we're entering the world where we can move up the stack in engines. We can sense and learn. I imagine the world where cognitive engines learn as we sleep. And instead of coming in and you're having a list of exceptions, you have a list of what that cognitive engine changed overnight and the recommendations of what you should do. When I was a planner, I'd get my cup of coffee, I'd look at my exceptions. Usually by noon, I was ready to run my next planning run because it took me that long for exceptions. In the new world, our systems are going to think as we sleep, and they're going to make changes, and they're going to tell us what to do. And I envision the world of supply chain that works on a rules-based ontology that looks like this, that maps many ifs to many thens. Now, today's supply chain are single ifs to single thens, things like ATP and allocation and inventory matching. And as the business changes, those single ifs to single thens can't work very well. But what if we had a rules-based ontology, which is a set of truths? So this customer gets these products, this runs out, substitute this products, and that is an adaptive system. And within each of the nodes, I have prescriptive analytics or cognitive analytics that perhaps tells me the intersection between warehouse management and transportation or customer-centric profiles. And this rules-based ontology is thinking and learning and changing and telling me better answers. A very different world for supply chain. Every year I do a conference and I ask people to say, by 2030, what are the most important analytics techniques that will be in the center, not in the alphabet soup? Cognitive reasoning, very important. 7% of companies today are using cognitive reasoning. A third will be using it by 2030 and may actually accelerate a little bit more. Concurrent optimization, the ability to have concurrency across functions. Internet of Things, the ability to bring streaming data, sentiment data, unstructured text mining, looking at patterns. I love this new world of analytics. It's a chance for us to learn. It's a chance for us to question our paradigms. We can't just think about planning with linear optimization and simple functional engines. Instead, what we've got to think about are different forms of inputs, cognitive computing, ontologies, schema on read, planning master data systems with machine learning to really drive sensing, learning, and acting. This is the world that I see. My problem is that the world has become very conservative. This used to be a bell curve of just as many early adopters or late adopters. But what's happened is we've implemented systems, even though there's more and more technology capabilities, more and more people are becoming late adopters. And I encourage you to test and learn, test new forms of planning, challenge the current state. The technology innovation is happening with the best-of-breed providers. Use cloud, cognitive computing, machine learning. Don't be afraid to ask questions that you don't know, because we're stuck. We're not happy with our systems. And I think it needs us to embrace a new way. So if you're an early adopter, run right out and embrace these new technologies and work in co-development. Build capabilities, particularly at the executive team. A lot of times people will talk about, I don't have the planning knowledge. A bigger issue is, I think, the executive team understanding of the supply chain. Things like sales-driven is not the same as market-driven, right? Sales input is very limited compared to what the market potential is. Forecast-driven or budget-driven is not the same as really driving opportunities. What is the role of the budget? How do we manage manufacturing load? What is the strategy? Train your executives. And then build with the goal in mind. Challenge traditional thinking. And don't forget that the supply chain's a complex system. This is like a decathlon. This is like balance of nonlinear complex objects that are going to become even more complex. I think it's time to take a different path. And I encourage you to read my writing and my research and challenge your organization. We're ready for questions. So let's pass the mic and have a dialogue. We got about 5 minutes. Thank you. Vivek's got the mic, and if you can just tell me a little bit about yourself and your name and your company and give me a question, I'd love to have a dialogue. So Vivek, pick on Nicole because she's sitting right there. Nicole, raise your hand. We're going to get you started. So Nicole, do you have a question? Do you have a comment?
Thanks, Laura. That's great. Well, I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks with Lora, so I feel like I've gotten a lot of my questions answered as we've gone through. But if you were a company out here and you were trying to take those steps from being stuck and into moving forward and into some of these different concepts, and you were trying to take those next steps, what would be your suggestions in order to make that happen?
Thank you, Nicole. Nicole and I are actually working with Test and Learn, Cognitive Computing, Schema on Read Pilot. Nicole works for Capgemini, so thank you. I would start with building my own orbit chart. I would take the inventory turns and operating margin at the intersection. I would plot it out, and I would say, am I really making improvement? Because you see the patterns in that plot that you don't see in an Excel spreadsheet. I do the same at the intersection of growth and return on invested capital, and if I have customer service data for that period of time, I do the same thing. And then I would socialize it. I would go from office to office. I'd invite people to have lunch, and I'd say, you know, you think you're driving continuous improvement because you have these programs, but look at the total effect on total cost. It's usually shocking. Every time I do this, people are like shocked. And then I would question about how technology has driven improvement or not driven improvement. And the ability to think differently about technology. Instead of big projects with as-is to to-be, I would encourage the executives to fund small, scrappy teams. And I would pull out the money from my continuous improvement projects, and I'd put it on the table, and I'd say, I'll fund it if you let me build a small team and test and learn. Don't get the big buses and consultants, and bring in the best-of-breed providers that are really doing cool things, test and learn, and really establish up front that you may fail along the way, but sometimes failure is your best learning. That's what I would do. Yeah, other thoughts? Yes, hi.
Hi, Laura. I'm Eric Lang with Anaplan.
Yes, hi, Eric.
Hi, we've talked.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. If I were a customer and I knew that I needed to completely revamp my supply chain, you know, at Anaplan, we can either do a full end-to-end employment or maybe do some very specific use cases within supply chain. Where would you start in most companies? Where would you begin? On the demand side or on the supply side or S&OP? Or where would you begin in that journey? Where would you tell most customers to start?
I think you can't generalize. I think you've got to really start with the goal in mind with where you see the biggest issues. It's hard to generalize. Opportunity abounds. I think there's no one right answer there. Yes?
Oh, sorry, I had a quick question. Yeah, my name is Alina Vandenhack. Sorry. And I work with end-to-end analytics. We focus a lot on supply chain, pricing and promotion, all the cool stuff, I think.
Okay, good.
But one of the companies I worked at previously, I worked in designing and setting up supply chains for new-to-the-world products. And one of the problems was that you would set up a supply chain at the start, and the mentality of a lot of the coworkers was that this was a supply chain, it was going to stay the same for the next 5 years.
Yes.
And one of the things you talked about was sensing and having an intelligent response before instead of reacting. So I think one of the aspects of that is planning, but the second aspect is being able to have a flexible enough supply chain to respond in time. What are your thoughts about setting up a flexible supply chain and the best practices around that?
I think it's a great question. Thank you for the gift. I think the adaptive supply chain starts with us thinking about the atoms and the electrons differently. If we think about the supply chain, what makes us different than other forms of planning is the fact that we have atoms, right? We convert things, we transform things. And so as we think about what we value, efficiency is not always effective, right? Long lines, long batch runs. So as we think about how do we value flexibility and adaptive, and then how does that change the atoms of our supply chain? 3D printing, perhaps fermentation, perhaps different conversion, perhaps collaborative economy. We got to think about the atoms differently. And then we have to really have the mindset that our supply chains need to be adaptive, that the most effective supply chain isn't always the most efficient supply chain. And that's a very different mindset. And I would start with the chief financial officer to have that discussion. And I would show him through discrete event simulation how an efficient, lowest cost supply chain can be very ineffective in the lumpy demand tail. And then I would start building it and use some of the new tools. Other questions? We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Sam Touchstone. I'm with Lodge Cast Iron Manufacturing in Tennessee.
Hi. Yeah.
And I have kind of two questions. So we are a 122-year-old private family business.
Yes.
And I think we have some employees and processes that have been around for 122 years.
Yeah, a lot of people feel that pain, yeah?
So how do we go about, A, asking the right questions, and what are those, and then B, culturally trying to get our teams to make those changes?
I think that's a great question. One of the opportunities I think we have is the fact that people like me, and perhaps people like you, gray hair, baby boomers are retiring. And it's a good chance when we bring new employees in that are millennials that think a little differently to teach them the past, but then to ask all of our teams to unlearn the past, to relearn together. And I usually start by taking the last year and mapping it on the wall and saying, where did we not do well? What were our issues? And then training them to think about the art of the possible. What could we have done differently? Was there unstructured data we could have used? Was there streaming data that we could use? Was there data in the organization that could have helped us? How did our processes help or hinder us? And then use that as a learning template. The other thing I would encourage you to do is invest in human resources, training. We sit on a database of 9,000 responses, and we continually correlate our responses to financial results. Last year, we took 560 characteristics of supply chain, and we correlated them to EBITDA and operating margin. The only thing that had a significance was investment in training. It wasn't a common ERP, it wasn't a type of consultant used, it wasn't a type of data set, it was the investment in human training and really helping people to be empowered about supply chain. And so, get your training of sorts. We offer training at Supply Chain Insights. We offer monthly webinars. I give all my research away, podcasts, encourage them to read our stuff and, come to our community. Invest in people. I hope that helps you. Okay, thank you very much. This is where you'll find me. Listen to my podcast, read my stuff, join my march for supply chain change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.